All right. Hi, everyone. Our names are Jenna, Jasmine, and Meg, and this is our group project, our research replication. Basically, the research that we decided to replicate was to see if contingency management increased step counts. So let's get started. We'll start out with the review of supporting literature. A review of supporting literature. The percentage of people considered obese in the US has increased significantly within the last 20 years. Individuals are considered obese when their body mass index or BMI number is 30 or higher. To break it down, obesity is a disease that can often lead to mortality. Metabolic conditions, which includes obesity and diabetes, does account for over 60% of global mortality. Obesity may often be due to the amount of time an individual is sedentary. So sedentary time just means the duration of time of physical inactivity. So it could just be, the amount of time that you're laying down or sitting or reclining. All of that would count as any time that you're physically inactive. Increasing physical activity has been associated with several health benefits, including physiological benefits, and there's many methods to measure physical activity levels. One of the ways to measure physical activity levels that we decided to use within our research application is accelerometers. Accelerometers are small devices that can be worn on the body to measure activity levels, including steps taken as it occurs in real time. So this can be anything as Fitbits or Apple Watches or any sort of technology that can measure your activity level. If you see below, I have a couple of images. This one on the very far left, it's an Apple Watch. As you can see there, it counts your calories, the total steps taken, and the total distance. It's all in real time. The one on the right is a Fitbit, and the screen, it just tells you the step counts. I believe both of them have apps that can help you track your step counts, and you can take screenshots and send it out to those in order to keep track of those step counts. We decided to use Apple Watches, and we were able to measure our step counts and send it out to the rest of the group, but we can talk about that more later. Measuring physical activity levels alone, such as step counts, aren't enough to increase or decrease physical activity levels. It's strictly just to measure. Physical activity is a behavior that can be modified. Therefore, it's a behavior that can be modified by behavior analysts. Behavior analysts are qualified to create and implement strategies to change behavior, such as our physical activity levels. Monitoring the frequency of behavior and providing reinforcement when goals are met can be a successful method in increasing physical activity, otherwise known as contingency management. So now that we've assessed the literature, let's review the original study that we decided to replicate. We decided to replicate a study from Washington, Bana, and Gibson from 2014. What they basically studied was to see if a price-based contingency was able to increase physical activity across 11 adults. These 11 adults wore Fitbit accelerometers to measure their step counts for 3 weeks. The study utilized an ABA reversal design where each phase was a baseline intervention and a second baseline phase, and each phase lasted 1 week each. Reinforcement for participants included a prize draw on the day's criteria was met. For the prizes were inside a prize bowl. There were 100 tickets, and then each ticket number corresponded to a prize. During baseline, 50% of the tickets were verbal praise, and 50% of them were small prizes that were around $5. During intervention phases, they kind of broke up a little bit more. 50% of the rewards were verbal praise, 42 were small prizes, 5% were medium prizes worth $15, 2% were large prizes worth $50, and then the 1% was a jumbo prize worth $120. The criteria to receive rewards were different for each phase. For example, baseline phases, participants earned a prize draw if they wore their Fitbit accelerometer. Intervention phases were different. Prize draws were only contingent upon if the participants met their individualized step criteria. The way they figured out each individual step criteria, they determined by calculating the 5th highest step count from each participant's baseline 1 phase. Results of the study demonstrated that step counts increased for 4 participants with an average of 4,387 steps per day. Purpose of our project. The purpose of this study was to evaluate the effects of contingent price reinforcement on the target behavior, which was meeting the step criteria. And now I will hand it off to Jenna, and she will discuss the second half of our presentation.
All right, so we are going to talk about the different methods that we used for our project. So first, we'll start out with the participants. Our participants were 3 females who were between the ages of 24 and 29. Each of these participants are currently enrolled in a graduate program, and all of us had an interest in increasing our overall health and had no noted health concerns. We each lived in different states in the United States, so instead of going to the same facility to report our step counts, we decided to use a screenshot of the app that recorded our steps and would send that screenshot through iMessage at the end of each day at 8 p.m. over the course of the 3 weeks. As far as the setting, data collection was being taken throughout the day, so it was across all environments that the participant encountered through their normal day, including when they went to work, any extracurricular activities around the house, or any other events that they had throughout their week. Data collection was sent to each member of the group by 8 p.m. at the end of the day. As far as the materials for the project, as previously mentioned, we used an Apple Watch as our accelerometer, an activity guide, which was also presented in the original study of Be Active Your Way, was provided to each of the participants, but was not required to be read. This activity guideline kind of outlines different ways that you can increase physical activity, different goals for individuals trying to increase their physical activity, and discusses different ways to monitor progress for adults. And then in addition to that, the materials for the prize draws were needed. All of the materials that were needed for the prize draws included the smartphone, a number generator app, a computer, a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, which had numbers that corresponded to prizes, and then the various prizes, small prizes, medium prizes, large prizes, and a jumbo prize. I do have a picture in the next slide that I can show how we differentiated that out. As far as our behavior, we were looking at step count, which was defined as the total number of steps taken from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. We chose this as this was kind of a rough estimate of when a subject would wake up and go to sleep, and this is what was reported by their Apple Watch. Examples of this would be accumulated by steps by walking or running, and what would not count as a step count would be hand movements while clapping or talking with your hands. So we used an ABA reversal design. So each of the 3 phases, our A was our baseline 1, B was intervention, and then baseline 2. And each of these lasted 1 week. As for our data collection, we would collect data every day using event recording with an Apple Watch to track the frequency of our step count. Participants took a screenshot at the end of the day to show the total step count for that day and then sent it to the other participants. And that data was then recorded into a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet based on the total step count that was represented in that screenshot. And our data was collected daily for 3 weeks. This is an example of our Excel document in which we recorded all of our data. You can see that we broke it out between baseline, intervention, and baseline 2. So for each of the phases, there were a little bit different methods. So for the baseline phases, we used the prize draw. Still happened every single day, but it was only based on whether or not the participant wore their Apple Watch. So it didn't matter how many steps that they took that day. Once they sent the screenshot, other participants would use a random number generator app to facilitate a prize drawing. After this, each participant had access to the spreadsheet that contained numbers from 1 to 100, and each number corresponded to a prize. So in the baseline phases, 50% of numbers corresponded to a verbal praise, and 50% corresponded to a small prize. Small prizes consisted of very small amounts, maybe a snack or some limited time doing something individuals enjoyed, like watching TV for 10 minutes or listening to music for 10 minutes. For the treatment phase, a criteria for the target number of daily steps a participant needed was determined by calculating their 5th highest number of steps that was found in the baseline phase. This was roughly estimated of 70% of their highest score. So they used a percentile to calculate how many steps were needed. So in order to receive reinforcement during the treatment phase, you had to hit the target number of daily steps in addition to wearing the watch. A step counter greater than the participant's 5th highest baseline day gave access for reinforcement. Similar to in the baseline phase, the participant took a screenshot of their daily step count and sent it to the other participants, and a prize draw occurred for each day the participant met their daily step counts. What also differed in the treatment phase was the percent of the different types of prizes. So in the treatment phase, 50% of the numbers corresponded to verbal praise, 42% of the numbers corresponded to small prizes, 5% to medium prizes, 2% to large prizes, and 1% was a jumbo prize. This is an example of the spreadsheet we used in order to calculate what prize each person got. So when you use the random number generator, it would come up with whatever that number was, and the participants would look in the spreadsheet to then provide that reinforcement. Because of the way our design was set up and the fact that we were all in different locations, participants had to provide their own prize. So if Meg had sent me her number and I calculated what prize she won and she won a candy bar, she would have to then provide her own candy bar. All right, as far as the IOA, all participants measured IOA by comparing their daily step count that the other participants sent via a screenshot with the daily step count that that person then recorded in Microsoft Excel for the corresponding day. IOA was collected for 42.8% of the sessions per phase. So this was 3 sessions per phase. And we calculated IOA using total count IOA, which was the smaller count of steps divided by the larger count of steps times 100. And we had 100% across all phases and participants. As far as treatment integrity, we created a treatment integrity checklist, which you'll see on the next slide. Some of the steps that were included in our checklist were that each participant took a screenshot on their phone that corresponded to their accelerometer that they wore for the day, that they sent the screenshot via the group text message, and that that you as the participant providing reinforcers were providing the reinforcement and you were giving the accurate reinforcement that corresponded to the correct phase, whether we were in the baseline phases or during the intervention phase. This was, like I said, conducted using a treatment integrity checklist, and we did this 7 times throughout the study, which was roughly 33% of the sessions, and treatment integrity was at 100%. And this is the checklist that we use. So On the days that we completed treatment integrity, we would place a check if the participant completed that step. And these were the steps that we felt were important for the integrity of our study. And next, we're going to talk about the results of our project, so I'll pass it off to Meg.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and discuss the results of our replication project of the original study. In this next slide, we have a table that contains all of our data for baseline 1 intervention and baseline 2 phases of our replication study. You can see we have laid out the data of daily step count averages and ranges for each of those phases for each participant, with Jenna, Jasmine, and Meg's steps all laid out within the table. Jenna and Jasmine's daily average increased, though not drastically, upon the implementation of the intervention phase. Jenna had an average step increase of 531.7 steps per day from baseline 1 to intervention phase, and Jasmine's step count increased an average of 1,502.8 steps per day. Meg's intervention average, so my average, was very similar to the baseline phase, with an average reduction in daily steps of 200.8 steps per day. And as we'll see when we look at the graph in the next few slides, there's kind of an outlier in data that brought the average down significantly, and that's something we'll discuss as well. But all participants' average step counts did decrease when the second baseline phase was introduced after the intervention phase was complete. So this table just kind of lays out all that data that was collected over each phase. The next slide is a visual of the graph of Jenna's daily step count. So this has the totals throughout all phases of the study for Jenna's step count. The dependent variable of daily step count is labeled as number of steps on the y-axis, and it's labeled in increments of 2,000 steps. And then the independent variable of days of the study is labeled as days on the x-axis across the bottom. The horizontal dotted line is the intervention phase. In the intervention phase is labeled prize draw, represents the reinforcement criterion for each day. So as previously discussed, we use the fifth lowest step count for the baseline 1 phase to determine the reinforcement criterion phase. So it's different for each participant based on their baseline 1 data. So that horizontal dotted line in Jenna's graph here in her prize draw intervention phase represents the number of steps required for her to receive that reinforcer. Jenna's intervention reinforcement criterion is 5,896 steps per day in the intervention phase, and Jenna met her reinforcement criteria of this 5,896 steps for 6 of the 7 days within that intervention phase. And then next we'll look at Jasmine's daily step count. This is Jasmine's graph of her daily step count. Her intervention reinforcement criterion is 6,683 steps per day during that intervention phase. And as you can see here, Jasmine met her reinforcement criteria of 6,683 steps for 5 of the 7 days of that intervention phase. And then the last graph that we'll look at is the graph of Meg's daily step count. So Meg's intervention reinforcement criterion was 9,723 steps per day for the intervention period. So I met my reinforcement criteria of 9,723 steps for 6 of the 7 days of that intervention phase. So for the conclusion of the project, we'll discuss the results a little bit more in detail, just discussing that the results of this study indicate that there is not a clear functional relation between the dependent variable, so our daily step count, and the independent variable of the contingent prize reinforcement. While the visual display of data in the graphs does show an immediacy of change during the intervention phase, there is overlap of data across all 3 conditions. Additionally, the data across the conditions is highly variable, and the magnitude of change in behavior is not likely socially significant. So each participant had at least one day during the intervention phase that they did not meet their reinforcement criteria. However, 2 participants still had an increase in their overall step count average during that intervention phase in comparison to both baseline phases. So it should also be noted that for all 3 of the participants, the days that they did not meet their reinforcement criteria was on a weekend. So each of our phases began on a Monday and ended on a Sunday. So the last 2 data points for each phase were weekend days, and of those days, of the intervention phases for each participant, the days in which they did not meet their reinforcement criteria did fall on a weekend. Not surprising, and similar to the original study, in which 5 of 10 participants in the original study that we replicated showed a functional relation between the prize draw contingency and step count data. So our results were similar to that of the original study. Although 2 of the participants had an increase in their average daily step count, the increases were not significant. Overall, there was an average improvement of 624.58 steps per day among all participants during the intervention phase when compared to that initial baseline phase. From the data obtained, we can conclude that a prize-based contingency management intervention may not be an effective intervention for increasing step count across all participants. Although we could see a functional relation or more of an impact on the step count with various other contingencies in place, and we'll discuss those here within the limitations of the project. So there are a number of limitations to consider when analyzing the replication of this project. So one limitation to discuss is the fact that all participants are adult females around the same age with similar schedules and responsibilities. So being around the same age and with similar schedules can result in a trend that fails to truly and accurately represent the impact that this intervention could have on other members of a population. Also within that, all of the participants are in a master's program and all participants are employed full-time. So with that being said, the master's program does require lengthy amounts of sedentary time by sitting or having to study or write papers on certain days. And then as well, the fact of all participants being employed full-time, that can impact their availability to accumulate daily steps. And this could either be a positive impact or a negative impact depending on the physical requirements of each participant's job. So they have to be more active on days that they work. They might have more of an opportunity to accumulate the daily step count. Whereas if their job requires them to sit at a desk more or be more sedentary, they might not have that opportunity as much on days that they do work. Another limitation to consider is the fact that household chores and other outside responsibilities could inhibit physical activity. So your chores can impede your ability to get to the gym or impede other opportunities to be physically active on days where participants had these other responsibilities. Also, varying weekend versus weekday schedules impacting results in data throughout each 7-day phase were obviously evident within our data as shown in our graphs. During those weekend schedules, there was a lot of variability within the phases. So it's important to note that there was a decline in steps on that 7th day of each phase, which we previously discussed was a Sunday for each of the 3 phases. And so therefore, it's important to consider that as a limitation to the fact that, that could be a rest day or a day for homework, things like that. So that could impact the results of the data. Another limitation that was considered was that reinforcers were possibly not motivating enough or were easily accessible. So as we discussed before, 50 of our 100 possible reinforcers listed were verbal praise. So that might not have been as reinforcing as necessary in order to develop a behavior change or create in order to create a behavior change for this project. So if we could have more reinforcing reinforcers, there might have been a more significant change in behavior. But also, a lot of the reinforcers listed were easily accessible. So if a reinforcer that you earned was a candy bar, who's to say that the participant didn't already have access to that prior to earning it for this project? Another possible limitation to consider is the fact that there could be lack of access to technology at times. So for example, not having access to a charger for the watch. I do know that for myself, as an example, I did go out of town one of the days while we collected data, and I forgot my charger when I went out of town. So my watch died on me that day, and it wasn't an accurate representation of the amount of steps I accumulated throughout that day. And then lastly, the last limitation we discussed was submitting steps prior to the end of each day. So that is saying 11:59 p.m. As we discussed previously in the presentation, we took screenshots at 8 o'clock p.m. So there's a good 4 hours of time after that before your day ends where more steps are accumulated, but they were not accounted for within our data. So those are all limitations to consider when thinking about the results of this project and the behavior change. And then lastly, we just have some references listed for looking back and reviewing the supporting literature and our claims made for the purpose of this project.
All right, great job, guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. That was a fantastic presentation. So very well done. I wrote down a couple questions. First, I want to mention that the sequence of how you went through everything in the intro is really great, and I recommend using that same sequence for when you do the write-up of the paper. So I've been kind of talking to each group about this because the way you've set it up is really how you would typically see an introduction flow. You know, you indicate why this is an important behavior to address, what's previously been done, and then usually the next to last paragraph would be the study that you plan to be replicating, and then that final paragraph in the intro is the purpose. And you guys did mention it's to replicate, but one thing I would add is that it's to replicate with a group of graduate students who are living remotely in different states. So that's a nice way to kind of extend the generalizability of the findings, is because you're actually doing it with a different sample of people who. These were adults in this study who were the participants, the original study. Okay. But there's like a bit of a difference because you guys are all in different states. And so you want to emphasize that and like what would be novel about your replication, which is that you're all graduate students living in 3 different locations or something like that. I've had a few groups pick this study for replicating, and I really think you guys did a great job of recognizing some of the limitations of and even like the social significance of the findings. And part of it, I think, is related to how they set the reinforcement criterion. So they have this sort of complicated way in which they've set it up, where it's like the 5th highest day in baseline is going to be your initial criteria, but you only have a 1-week phase. So if you were doing a changing criterion design, that would make sense to me to start with that type of a criterion that's that low, and then increase it incrementally. But then you're supposed to reverse back to baseline. And so when I see a criteria set that low, it doesn't provide a whole lot of incentive to increase your step counts compared to baseline. So just one thing I want to know is, and there are a bunch of different studies out there on sort of increasing step counts, and they set the goals differently. Do you guys have any suggestions for how the goals were set that may have changed your performance?
Yeah, I think the fact that we had to do a 5th highest step count definitely impacted our goal. So if we had really great days where we would reach 10,000 steps, that goal wouldn't be set. It's not high enough. So instead of pushing to increase our step count than just doing our 5th highest, doing it just from our highest step count from baseline probably would have increased our goal a little bit better, in my opinion.
I agree.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I was going to say too. Also, in the original study, they kind of discussed the fact that doing the reversal design, but doing going from your second baseline and taking data from that before introducing another intervention phase might have given you more consistency, because I know, especially for us, we had a lot of data points. We didn't see a lot of consistency within those phases. Kind of maintaining that consistency before switching phases might also offer more opportunity to generate a better idea of exactly how many steps are accumulated on an average day outside of just that initial baseline phase.
Yeah, I definitely see a few of these reversal studies where it's based on the number of days in each phase as opposed to the stability of the data, which poses a number of issues. I mean, you may have a lot of variability, you might have some problematic trends, and it's often for convenience for the researchers for them to do just like a week-long period. But we know as behavior analysts, it tends to be better practice to be basing your phase changes on the stability of each of your legs. So that's a good point to bring up. A lot of the other studies that have, not some of them, that have set goals, they'll do a goal that's like 1,000 steps higher than their average baseline performance. Do you think if you guys would have had that as like a goal in the intervention phase, that you may have seen a stronger increase?
I think for me, that would have been a great recommendation, just because that average step count, I think, is a better representation of what I typically would do every day, because it doesn't really the outliers don't really impact that as much as I would say taking the fifth highest step count would. So taking that average and adding 1,000 to it, I think, is kind of a more realistic expectation, and also probably easier to build off of for further intervention phases.
I also agree with that. I think with the fifth highest, especially since we talked about the days, like our weekend days, having such a low data point, it kind of skews our data a little bit, I think. And I also think sometimes that fifth day was probably what we were doing anyways for most of the time. And so it wasn't really a challenge for us, and it didn't create that significant behavior change, because it was, if you look at our graphs where that reinforcement criteria line is, it's pretty similar to a lot of the data points that were in our baseline phases. So if we had something that was exceeding step counts in our baseline, I think there would have been more of a challenge for us to rise to.
Yeah, absolutely. And in line with that too, you guys did a good job recognizing that, maybe the reinforcer wasn't as motivating. And one thing that I think you mentioned, but some folks may not quite understand about this study, is that even if you hit your goal for the number of step counts, you still weren't guaranteed a reinforcer. You were just put into a prize draw, and you had, a 50% chance to get a reinforcer, because the other were just verbal praise. So can you also think of maybe a way in which you could have changed the reinforcer that would have made it a little bit either more effective or more motivating for you guys as participants?
I think if we could have changed the reinforcement schedule almost as to where we had a greater chance of receiving a tangible item or time doing an enjoyable task, such as watching TV or socializing, listening to music, as we spoke about previously. But like you said, to have a 50% chance of just a verbal reinforcer, which for us was a text back like, great job. One of them was, you're losing weight already, things like that. So that wasn't really like, oh, I need to get this additional 1,000 steps in order to get that, reinforcing text message. So I think if we increase the likelihood of a more meaningful reinforcer, and even within those actual small, medium, large, and jumbo reinforcers, even making more jumbo reinforcers as opposed to small reinforcers, just so there was a greater likelihood of having that meaningful reinforcer and then giving us something more tangible to work for. Even, in speaking of the limitations and talking about how easily accessible some of those reinforcers were, we spoke about the fact that one of the reinforcers was, 10 minutes of TV time. Well, I could have 10 minutes of TV time, whether I earned it with reinforcer or not. I might have already had it that day. So it's not necessarily something I'm going to work for. But say we made it 30 minutes of TV time, that's something more significant or out of the ordinary that I wouldn't typically do on a normal day. So just increasing the reinforcers and making them more valuable to the participants, I think could have been a very beneficial change.
Yeah. Sorry. I think I was going to say the same thing of a lot of those reinforcers were something that we might already be accessing. So it kind of loses that value. I think had we maybe changed the whole reinforcement system and maybe isolated something that was special to each of us or that we were motivated for and that we committed to not accessing unless we actually hit the target, it might have been more effective. Whereas I think what Meg was saying, even some of those larger prizes, they might have been something that we already had, or for example, like if we earned a candy bar, but none of us had a candy bar in the house, then you still weren't accessing that reinforcement because I'm not going to go out and buy it. I think that was another limitation too, is it had to be provided by ourselves. So anything that did cost money was also kind of, did I actually really want to spend it in order to reinforce myself or not?
Yeah, I was going to add on to that. In the study, their list of prizes were significantly different than ours. So we stated, we used like treats and 10 minutes of TV time. But in the study, they did like the large prizes, for example, was like a Kindle or like a Brita. I think another one was like an iPad. So these aren't really things that we're able to reinforce ourselves with. And I think that's probably why there was some success within, I think it was 4 of their participants, is the ability to earn that prize draw to get those larger prizes that unfortunately, we don't have that money to reinforce ourselves with something as big as that.
Yeah, those were all good answers. It makes a big difference when you're administering your own reinforcers, and it takes a lot of self-control and discipline to reserve those reinforcers only for if you have earned them, and not just giving them to yourselves regardless. So one thing that some folks have also said is like, okay, I didn't earn a candy bar, but I gave myself ice cream instead. And, I didn't earn my iPad time, but I sat on the computer or something. And so, I think it's very relevant too of just our clinical work when we're trying to talk with parents about kind of withholding certain items to have them stay valuable, and have a potent reinforcer. But they may provide access to something that's just as equivalent that, then kind of will influence the potency of the reinforcer. And I've also had students in these projects say, yeah, then I had to go out and buy myself something. And so I felt like the behavior of meeting the goal was almost punished because then I was out, a few bucks or something because I had to go out because the money's coming out of my own pocket. So it definitely makes a difference, and it's going to influence how effective your reinforcer is. One last question that I have is you guys all used Apple Watches, right? Do you guys find that the application for tracking steps was accurate, or were there times where you noticed, other than when it wasn't being charged, that it may have been tracking a step when you weren't actually walking, or that it was maybe missing some, just in terms of the accuracy of it as a step count tracker?
I did notice when it would be time. Oh, I'm sorry. That I would be looking at my watch and seeing it on the app where it counts your total step counts. I'm on a walk, I would pull up the health app on my iPhone, and it wouldn't sync immediately. I think, like, I don't know if anyone else's Apple Watch was different or if mine was an older version, and that's why it didn't sync as often, but it would take maybe 10 minutes at a time for it to actually sync up with real time step count activity.
Yeah, I agree with the syncing issue. And then as far as the accuracy of the actual step count itself, I think there are obviously instances in which, you know, you move your hands and it counts a step that's actually a false step because, say, you're clapping your hands and you're not actually partaking in that physical activity. However, there were also instances where I was more physically active and the steps weren't counted. Like on days when I'd go to the gym, and if I was on the stationary bike, well, during that whole time, I'm not always moving my arms with every motion of my feet. Sometimes when I'm tired, I'll like leave my hands in my lap, and it's not accumulating those steps. So I think there's, you know, accuracy issues on both ends of it. And I noticed that, you know, even prior to this replication project. So I would agree that, you know, there are, you know, inaccuracies on both ends of that data collection.
Yeah, I'm starting to see more studies out there trying to compare the reliability of or the accuracy of some of these various fitness tracking apps, and some seem to be a little bit better than others. And so I think that there's some researchers that are sort of launching that type of research right now. But I think it's still a start, and it's great for us to be able to have this technology to help us, you know, improve our physical fitness. So that was a fantastic presentation. I hope you guys enjoyed doing it, and I think we're all set.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, nice job.
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Do I just